Hello class, I wanted to send you a video to help you figure out how to mix flesh tones. And like anything else in painting, it takes practical experience to really figure out what works and what doesn't, but I can give you guys some general guidelines to get you started. I'm going to be using oil paint for the demo today, but it's the same exact pigments in oil paint as it is in acrylic, so it's pretty much exactly the same. It'll look the same. I'm going to bring your attention over here to the paints that I have set up, and this is really useful for both acrylic and oil painters. Human flesh tone is a really complex color. It's actually created in reality through layers of colors. That's why it's so complex, but primarily it can be mixed with a combination of browns, reds and yellows and white in varying amounts. So as long as you're staying primarily with your browns, your reds, your yellows and your whites in varying combinations, it should look somewhat like a flesh tone. And to be honest, it can be quite forgiving as long as you've matched your values, your lights and darks correctly. Two additional colors that I'll bring your attention to for mixing flesh tones that are useful are Naples yellow and yellow ochre. They're both already a flesh tone looking color, and so they're really useful to add to the palette. And then for your darker tones of shadow on the skin, if you look at the darker tones of my hand, it's useful to have the blues mixed in small amounts there, and I'll show you that. So the first thing you want to do when you need to mix a flesh tone is mix up your light, your dark, and a mid-tone at the very least. There's some figurative painters that mix up many more tones than that, but we'll just start with 4. Let's do 2 mid-tones, a light, and a dark. So I'm going to dip into the stand oil. It's similar to the way you guys use matte medium with the acrylic paint. It's to help with the consistency of the paint and the spreadability. So the first thing I do when I'm trying to mix a flesh tone, and let's just say I'm going to mix my hand flesh tone, is you decide what's the main color I'm seeing. And so when I compare my hand to this palette, I would say that the closest color is this yellow ochre. So I'm going to grab a generous portion. Especially if you're working in acrylic paint, you want to be using a lot of paint to mix because it will dry very fast in small amounts. Oil painters, you got days. But it's always a good idea to mix a lot anyway, so that way you're not skimpy with the paint and stingy with it. You want to mix up enough so that way you can use plenty. Alright, so once you decide what the main tone is, then you start asking yourself, what other colors am I seeing in this? So I see there's a hint of the cold brown, the burnt umber, so I'm going to mix a little bit of that in for a mid-tone. Maybe that was a little too much. I'm seeing a bit of the cold red, alizarin crimson, and if you grab too much paint, you can always wipe on the palette to take off some. So I'm seeing some cold red. There's 2 types of whites on my palette right now. This is titanium white, it's opaque. This is zinc white, it's semi-translucent. So for mixing flesh tones, the translucent zinc white can be a little less chalky looking. So I'm going to add a little bit of the zinc white in. We'll see where we're at. I think I could use a little bit more yellow. It's a little too much yellow. And I would say add a little bit of warm red. I find that with flesh tones, if they're not quite right, switching from the cold or the warm red makes a huge difference. The cold or the warm brown makes a huge difference as well. But I would say this is close. I'm just going to dull it with a tiny bit of black. The biggest mistake people make when mixing flesh tones is they make it too saturated, so their flesh tones look like Muppets. This is definitely very saturated. So I'll leave this for now. I'll come back to it. But what I'm going to do is take the paint that's in my brush and distribute it off to start mixing my shadow tone. So by default, I'll start a shadow tone. I'm mixing this basically. I'll start a shadow tone by default with, oops, that was black. That is not salvageable. I'll use that for my hair. So I'm going to wipe off some of this black, but I can definitely use that for the hair part. And I don't mind leaving a little bit of black in the brush because, like I mentioned before, the biggest mistake people make when mixing flesh tones is that they are too saturated. So if there's a little bit of black, that's okay because it'll dull my flesh tone a bit. There's 4 ways to dull a color. Adding black will dull it, adding white, adding gray, and adding the complementary color of whatever color you're dealing with will dull it as well. So I'm mixing my shadow tone right now. So that was mostly a bit of the cold blue, the phthalo blue, the cold brown, the burnt umber, because it's a very cold shadow. And then I warmed it up a bit with that burnt sienna. And I'm okay with that for now. So then let's wipe off brush. And those of you that are gonna try the oil paint, ordinarily I would use, in oil painting we don't use water, we use Gamasol. It's a solvent, and so I'm just minimizing the amount of fumes from the solvent by just cleaning my brush by wiping it. So it's something that you guys can try out. So now I'm going to mix my light tone. So I'm going to take some of that mid-tone that I mixed. I'm going to look at my hand. My highlight on my hand's a little warmer red. It's a little yellower. I'm going to take quite a bit of zinc white. And I'm going to grab some of the Naples yellow. Stand it well for yellow. And it's way too saturated. So I'm going to mix in more of the white. Take a little bit more warm red. A little bit of cold red. So when I'm mixing my flesh tones, I keep asking, how is my actual flesh tone different than what I'm mixing? So right now when I look, this is way more yellow than what I'm seeing. So I'm actually going to take some of the opaque white to dull it. There we go. And so that's dulling. And it still feels pretty yellow. So I'm going to dull it with a little bit of burnt umber, just a tiny bit. A little bit more white. You know what I'll do? I'll let these two be my midtones, and then I'll just add copious amounts of white to what was on the brush from this to create my bright highlight. And I'm looking at my reference photo right now, and my bright highlight's a little yellower. So I'm gonna make sure to get some Naples yellow. So the good news with mixing flesh tones is it's very forgiving. If you're combining reds, yellows, browns, mostly and white, it's gonna look pretty fleshy. The biggest danger is too saturated. Like, I'm not happy with this at all. I might actually take the white that I'd mixed, the light, use it to dull this batch. That's much closer actually to what I was looking for in a mid-tone. And so that's how you mix up. Let's just take it a shade darker with the burnt sienna. I'm looking at my reference and trying to match it to a mid-tone I'm looking at. So now I have two different mid-tones, a lighter one and a darker one. I have a shadow tone for the dark shadows. I have my highlight for the bright highlights, and then I'll show you in the next video how I use those to paint a self-portrait. But those of you trying to mix flesh tones, this is a good place to get started.